Tonight, we journey back nearly 500 years to follow the incredible path of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, a man who wandered across deserts, rivers, and unknown lands in the early 16th century. His tale is one of shipwrecks, survival, and strange encounters, a story whispered by history itself. So, settle in. Find the most comfortable spot, close your eyes, and let your mind drift. If you enjoy gentle journeys through the past, remember to like this video, subscribe for more bedtime history, and share your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear what part of this story stayed with you. Now, take a deep breath and let's begin our voyage into the world of Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca. In 1527, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, a Spanish nobleman and experienced soldier, joined an ambitious expedition led by Pánfilo de Narváez. Their mission was to explore and claim vast new lands for Spain along the Gulf Coast of North America. They set sail from Spain with around 600 men and 5 ships, carrying dreams of gold, glory, and conquest. The journey began with high hopes, but trouble started almost immediately. Storms battered the fleet, scattering ships and forcing them to seek shelter in the Caribbean before pressing onward. Disease and hunger began to weaken the crew even before they reached Florida. By the time the expedition finally landed near Tampa Bay in 1528, they had already lost time, supplies, and several men. On land, they encountered dense swamps, relentless mosquitoes, and a humid climate that sapped their strength. Relations with the indigenous peoples quickly turned hostile, partly because of the Spanish demands for food and resources. The local terrain offered little in the way of easy hunting or farming, and soon hunger began to bite. Instead of retreating to the safety of their ships, Narváez made a fateful decision: to march inland in search of riches. Cabeza de Vaca, though skeptical, followed his orders. The men trudged for weeks through marshes and rivers, their armor rusting and their clothes in tatters. Supplies dwindled to almost nothing, and what little food they found, wild plants, roots, and occasional game, was never enough for hundreds of starving men. By the time they staggered back to the coast, exhausted and demoralized, they found that their ships were gone, separated by the tides and storms. With no way home and surrounded by an unfamiliar and hostile land, the expedition's hope for conquest was quickly turning into a desperate struggle for survival. With their ships gone and no clear way back to safety, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca and the surviving members of the Narváez expedition faced a grim choice: stay on the Florida coast and likely starve, or try to reach Spanish settlements in Mexico by sea. Lacking real ships, they began building crude rafts from timber, palm fiber, and anything they could scavenge. It took weeks of exhausting labor under the burning sun and constant threat from hostile tribes. When the rafts were finally ready, the men pushed off into the Gulf of Mexico, carrying only limited water and food. From the start, the voyage was a disaster. Storms blew them off course, currents scattered the rafts, and the men grew weak from thirst and hunger. After weeks adrift, Cabeza de Vaca's raft, along with a few others, washed ashore somewhere along the Texas coast in the fall of 1528. By then, most of the men were too weak to walk. Several died almost immediately after reaching land. The survivors were taken captive by local indigenous groups who saw little value in the starving strangers. Over the next few years, Cabeza de Vaca's life became one of constant hardship. He was enslaved by different tribes, forced to gather firewood, carry loads, and dig for edible roots. Many of the Spaniards who had landed with him perished from disease, exhaustion, or violence. He endured freezing winters without shelter, survived on meager scraps, and learned the hard lessons of life far from his homeland. It was during this period that Cabeza de Vaca began to adapt. He learned native languages, studied local customs, and slowly earned a place as a trader, moving between tribes with goods such as shells, hides, and medicinal herbs. Though still a captive, he gained more freedom of movement and began to understand that survival here would not come from force of arms, but from learning and adaptation. After years of hardship and forced labor, Álvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca saw a chance for escape. In 1534, along with 3 other survivors, Andrés Dorantes, Alonso del Castillo, and an African slave named Estebanico, he fled captivity. They had no maps, no weapons, and no supplies beyond what they could carry. Their only hope was to head west, toward the vague promise of Spanish settlements somewhere beyond the endless plains and deserts. The journey took them across what is now Texas, northern Mexico, and the American Southwest. They traveled on foot for thousands of miles, passing through lands inhabited by dozens of different indigenous groups. At first, they were strangers and potential enemies, but Cabeza de Vaca and his companions slowly built trust through trade, diplomacy, and their growing reputation as healers. They treated wounds with herbal remedies, performed rituals they had learned from their captors, and offered blessings in the name of both Christian and native beliefs. Word of their healing powers spread ahead of them, and they were often welcomed with gifts of food and shelter. For the first time since the disaster began, they were not merely surviving, they were being sought out and respected. Yet the journey was still grueling. They crossed deserts under a burning sun, forded icy rivers, and endured constant hunger. Their clothes wore out completely, leaving them nearly naked. Some tribes offered hospitality, while others were suspicious and even hostile, forcing the 4 men to move on quickly. After 8 years of wandering, in 1536, they finally encountered a group of Spanish slave raiders near the Sinaloa River in Mexico. The reunion was bittersweet. These Spaniards were shocked to see countrymen emerge from the wilderness, but they were also in the business of capturing and exploiting the very people who had kept Cabeza de Vaca alive. Horrified by the cruelty he witnessed, Cabeza de Vaca argued for better treatment of the indigenous peoples, but his words had little effect. Eventually, he returned to Spain, carrying with him a remarkable story of endurance, adaptation, and survival against impossible odds. His written account, La Relación, remains one of history's most extraordinary first-hand survival narratives, proof that sometimes the greatest weapon is not a sword, but the ability to adapt. November 4, 1914. Britain's ship Endurance was advancing toward Antarctica, the world's most dangerous and mysterious continent, crossing some stormy seas. This ship carried a crew of 28 people, commanded by explorer Sir Ernest Shackleton, who wanted to achieve something never done before in history: to cross the entire Antarctic continent on foot. Before we proceed, if you want to enjoy this journey more, imagine that you are also one of the crew members and suffer from all the hardships of that survival journey and feeling -50 degrees cold. Before you enter that survival journey, please tell your location and then like, comment, and subscribe for more videos of that kind. Now you're entering in an era with no smartphones, no GPS, no modern technology. Instead of lack of all these technologies, the crew is still intended to cross this icy continent completely on foot, in -50 degrees cold amidst blizzards, from top to bottom. Their plan was to reach the Antarctic coast via the Weddell Sea by ship. Look at the map. Exactly here, they would land, then trek on foot to the South Pole, cross it, and continue walking to reach the Ross Sea. A total trek of about 2,900 kilometers. If everything went according to plan, it would take roughly 120 days. But how disastrously this plan would fail, and what they would endure next, neither they could imagine at the time, nor can you, friends. November 5, 1914. The Endurance ship arrives at a whaling station on South Georgia Island. This was the last human settlement in their path. If you look at it on the map, this group of islands is located near the tip of South America. Below it lies the protruding part of Antarctica, called the Antarctic Peninsula, alongside the Weddell Sea, a sea surrounded on 3 sides by Antarctic land. Because of this, sea ice couldn't escape easily, forming a dense, permanent layer of ice. That day, the weather was terrible, and conditions in the Weddell Sea were equally bad. People there advised Shackleton, delay this mission, otherwise going there in these conditions will be extremely risky. But Shackleton remained stubborn. He said, "No matter what, we will proceed." December 5, 1914. The Endurance pushed forward, but soon the feared happened. The ice in the Weddell Sea turned out to be far heavier and denser than expected. Yet Shackleton continued. January 18, 1915. After sailing along the ice edge for some time, the ship became completely trapped in ice. A few days later, some crew members spotted a 15-foot crack in the ice 50 yards from the ship. This small crack was their last hope of escape. For 3 hours, they tried to free the ship by running the engine at full speed with maximum power, but the ship didn't move an inch. Crew members came out and tried to chip the ice with axes and chisels, but failed. Slowly, the ice floe trapping the ship began drifting farther from land. The point on Antarctica where the crew was supposed to land was called Vassal Bay, but the trapped ship had now drifted 60 miles away. The problem was that open water still lay between this ice floe and Vassal Bay. The crew couldn't walk there from the ship. Meanwhile, the ship couldn't move because it was icebound. Weeks and months passed in attempts to free the ship. Antarctic winter was approaching, meaning 24 hours of darkness. Not a minute of sunlight for weeks or months. Shackleton ordered everyone to spend winter aboard the ship. But winter meant increasing cold, snowfall, and blizzards. Gradually, ice pressure began mounting on the ship. Photographer Frank Hurley was aboard, equipped with a camera. He took some photos at the time, which you can see on screen. They clearly show how nearby ice was crushing the ship. September 30, 1915. Clear cracks appeared on the ship's sides. But the crew still held hope. October 24, 1915. At 6:45 p.m., ice suddenly fractured violently under intense pressure, and a chunk crashed onto the ship. A massive ice block shattered the Endurance's stern post, flooding the ship. All crew members sprang into action, trying to pump out water. They pumped non-stop for 3 days. But water entered faster than they could empty it. Temperature, minus 8.5 degrees Celsius. Yet no fear or panic showed on the crew's faces. Some ventured out to cut away ice blocks pressing the ship, but it barely helped. Water kept flooding in rapidly, and ice pressure didn't lessen. Finally, Shackleton conceded defeat and ordered, "Abandon ship, get down." At this moment, crew member Tom McLeod, seeing the situation, said, "I don't think we'll ever make it home alive." The ship had been trapped for over 9 months. October 27, 1915. A sound like an explosion was heard. Shackleton turned back and saw a shocking sight. The ship's rear section had suddenly risen 20 feet into the air. The rudder and stern post tore away. Ship timbers began breaking, and the forward section flooded rapidly. Thankfully, all crew had evacuated by then. Soon, the water froze, causing the entire front section to sink slowly. As the ship sank, Shackleton's dream of crossing Antarctica on foot shattered. But now the question was graver. Could they even return alive? The crew had no radio, no telephone, no way to contact the outside world. They were stranded on an ice floe in the Antarctic Ocean, a floe drifting with the currents. On this floe was a large ice hummock where the crew set up camp. First, they took stock. What supplies remained? How much food and water? The answer? They had 3 small lifeboats, a sledge for moving on ice, some personal items, and about 1 month's rations. Just 1 month of food. Sleeping space was scarce. Many had to sleep directly on the ice. Most huddled together for warmth to avoid freezing. The chance of a passing ship finding them was nearly impossible. They were in the Antarctic Ocean. No ships came here. It had been over a year since they'd seen other humans. The outside world didn't even know if they were alive. No way to send messages, no hope of rescue. Shackleton had only one thing: trust in his own skills and experience. But how long could this trust keep him and his crew alive? What would they do when food ran low? Camping on ice wasn't a safe solution. It could fracture any time. They needed solid land. Shackleton calculated and estimated. The closest land was Paulet Island, across the icy sea about 550 kilometers away, an island at Antarctica's tip. Ironically, in 1903, after a Swedish ship got trapped, rescue gear had been left on Paulet Island for future stranded explorers. And Shackleton himself had funded that gear. Now, 12 years later, he was relying on it. He decided with the crew they would attempt to reach Paulet Island. All supplies would be hauled on sledges over the ice. Shackleton ordered, each man could carry only 2 pounds of essential items. Many had brought personal items when abandoning ship, but Shackleton said, "Nothing is more valuable than your life." He even left his own gold coins and Bible behind in the ice. Ship photographer Frank Hurley had about 400 photos and negatives. Due to the 2-pound limit, he could bring only 150 negatives. These 100 photos would later become proof of this historic event for the world. Within weeks, due to food shortages, the crew's puppies had to be killed. There was no other option. After days of preparation, all supplies were loaded onto boats and sledges. Each boat weighed nearly a ton and was hard to pull. Luck wasn't on their side. Summer had returned to Antarctica by then. Rising temperatures softened the ice surface, making hauling even harder. After 3 hours of labor, when the crew looked back, they'd covered only 1 mile. The path ahead worsened. Shackleton decided to camp there until the drifting ice floe moved closer to land. They named this ice floe Ocean Camp. Shackleton gave every crew member tasks to prevent boredom and depression. November 21, 1915. Pressure mounted on Endurance's rear section, causing it to suddenly lurch upward. It hung in the air briefly before slowly sinking completely beneath the ice. The crew had only moved a few kilometers away and witnessed this event. Though they'd abandoned it, watching the ship sink this way cast deep emotional gloom, like their last link to the world was gone. Now, only this ice floe and their ocean camp remained. Things were manageable for a few days, but weeks later, the ice floe suddenly drifted east, away from land. So on December 25, 1915, Shackleton decided, abandon ocean camp and attempt to march on foot again. But after just a few kilometers, they hit thin ice and open water. They could neither advance nor retreat. They set up camp on a new ice floe. To manage food scarcity, Shackleton imposed strict controls. Crew got 1 biscuit daily, diluted milk, cocoa, and a small amount of high-fat meat paste from cans. They also hunted seals and penguins for food. Food was still scarce, but Shackleton often lied about quantities to keep morale high. Don't worry, enough food to stay alive. He knew surviving this situation could take very long. What they needed most was mental strength. For months, their camp on this new floe continued. Thankfully, the ice drifted in the right direction. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months. A new year began. On the morning of March 23, 1916, Shackleton spotted something through the fog. As fog cleared, mountains appeared. He recognized Joinville Island. But this wasn't good news. Joinville Island was at the peninsula's northern tip, meaning they drifted so far that Paulet Island was behind them. Joinville was just 57 miles from Paulet, but at a 90-degree angle west, with impassable ice between. Shackleton studied his map. Northward, he saw only 2 islands left if they drifted further, Clarence Island and Elephant Island. Beyond that, thousands of kilometers of open ocean, with waves so high survival chances were near zero. The sea between South America's southern tip and Antarctica's northern tip is called the Drake Passage, the world's most dangerous sea. Waves here reach 12 meters high. Over 20,000 sailors have died here, and at least 800 ships have sunk in history. Even today, in 2025, crossing it by ship shows terrifying scenes. It shakes even the largest cruise ships. Shackleton knew if his crew drifted into the Drake Passage, death was certain. Meanwhile, food shortages grew dire. Even slightly less rotten meat reserved for dogs was fed to humans. For drinking water, each placed a small can of snow against their body, melting it with body heat. But one can yielded only a spoonful of water at a time. An interesting fact, though the crew totaled 28, officially it was 27. In August 1914, as the ship left Britain, a 28th man, Blackborough, had stowed away. Shackleton had earlier refused him. "You can't join." But he sneaked aboard secretly. When discovered, Shackleton told him bluntly, "If we face starvation, you'll be the first eaten." April 7, 1916. Drifting on the ice floe, the crew finally sighted Clarence Island, about 83 kilometers north. New hope surged until winds suddenly shifted east. Eastward lay no land. Within hours, Shackleton and his crew's hopes shattered. Their ice floe was breaking apart, now just 50 meters long. Staying longer was dangerous. Shackleton decided all crew would board the 3 lifeboats and row toward Clarence Island. This water wasn't just water, it was filled with ice chunks and bergs. Soon, they found a sturdier ice floe and set up camp. But as they did, a crack split it. Suddenly, a crew member, fireman Ernie Holness, fell into the water. Others scrambled to rescue him. Before they could recover, the iceberg split completely. Shackleton was stranded alone on one side, the rest drifted away in darkness on the other. No one knew what to do. Their leader, their commander, was gone. Then Shackleton's voice pierced the darkness. Crew members rowed back and rescued him. Back on the main floe, Shackleton first asked about Holness, who was shivering violently. Hypothermia risk was high. No fire could be lit. Without action, he'd freeze to death. Shackleton used his skills again. He ordered Holness to keep walking non-stop until his body heat dried his clothes. The poor man walked all night. Slowly, his clothes dried, and the cold lessened. Meanwhile, winds kept changing direction. 4 times they changed targets. First Clarence Island, then King George Island, then Hope Bay, finally deciding on Elephant Island, the last island before the Drake Passage, 160 kilometers northwest. As they drifted north, temperatures rose slightly to -8 degrees Celsius. Ice diminished, meaning fresh water ran out. Lips cracked from thirst. Throats were too dry to swallow food. They ate raw seal meat, swallowing it with blood. Their ice floe drifted closer to Elephant Island, now just 50 kilometers away. Shackleton ordered, "Launch the boats for the final journey." April 15, 1916. The crew couldn't believe their luck. All 3 boats landed safely on the island. After 497 days, they finally stood on solid ground. Having been through hell, this desolate lump of rock seemed like heaven. They couldn't believe their feet were on solid land, not ice. Joy was immense, but their troubles weren't over. Crew member Blackborough's legs had failed. Another, Rickinson, suffered a heart attack but survived. The biggest problem, Elephant Island was utterly desolate. No inhabitants, no rescue supplies, no way to contact anyone. Its location was so remote, no ships passed nearby. The question remained how to get home. Shackleton saw 3 options on the map. 1. Cape Horn, South America's southern tip, 800 kilometers northwest. 2. Falkland Islands, 880 kilometers east of South America. 3. South Georgia Island, 1,300 kilometers north for help. Options 1 and 2 were closer, but meant crossing the Drake Passage. Shackleton chose option 3. He believed winds and seas would favor a journey to South Georgia. After 36 hours non-stop climbing, on May 20, 1916, Shackleton, Worsley, and Crean successfully crossed the Allardyce Range and reached Stromness. This was the first time in history anyone had crossed South Georgia on foot. The impossibility is clear. After Shackleton, this feat wasn't repeated until 1955 by expert climbers with full gear. Shackleton had only courage, willpower, and stubbornness. When they reached the station, they were unrecognizable. Long beards, faces blackened except for eyes, clothes in tatters. The factory manager recognized Shackleton, the man who'd vanished in Antarctica with his crew 2 years earlier. Everyone at the station knew their story as a tragic tale, the man who died with his ship. They couldn't believe he stood before them alive. The manager gave them food, fresh clothes, and beds. They bathed and shaved. The next day, Worsley took a boat to King Haakon Bay and rescued the other 3 crewmen waiting there. But Shackleton's real worry, his 22 crewmen stranded on Elephant Island. Over a month had passed since he'd seen them. Were they still alive? In such a situation, could you stay motivated to survive? Especially not knowing if your captain even survived the Drake Passage. Would rescue ever come? Honestly, comment below, how long could you survive? Shackleton tried urgently to rescue them, but upon arriving by ship, it got icebound. A second attempt failed. A third failed too. 3 attempts in 3 months, all turned back. As time passed, Shackleton grew anxious. He requested an icebreaker from the British government. They offered the Discovery, but it would take weeks. Shackleton couldn't wait. He didn't know how long the crew could hold on. He requested another ship from Chile, the Yelcho. On August 25, 1916, he sailed for Elephant Island again. After 6 days, on August 30, they arrived successfully. What they saw stunned them. Shackleton had appointed Frank Wild as leader in his absence, knowing they'd need leadership to avoid despair and infighting. After Shackleton left, under Wild's orders, they'd turned 2 boats upside down to build a shelter. For 128 days, they lived there, surviving by hunting penguins and seals. Amid cold, hunger, and hopelessness, Frank Wild repeated every morning, "Pack your bags, friends. The boss may come today." Boss meant Shackleton. But the boss didn't come. Days became weeks, weeks became months. Every morning, Wild climbed a hill, scanning for ships, returning empty-handed each evening. After 4 months, morale faded. Crew member Blackborough's foot became badly infected. Gangrene set in. They had to amputate it. With each passing day, they believed Shackleton had never reached South Georgia. His boat must have sunk. 4 months and 6 days after Shackleton left, Frank Wild decided to move on. He ordered everyone to pack, not waiting any longer. They prepared to sail to Deception Island in their lifeboats. But as they readied to leave Elephant Island, they spotted a sight on the horizon, a ship approaching. It was the Yelcho. As it neared, they saw him, their commander, their boss, Shackleton. He's here. The boss had finally come to save them. Shackleton was stunned. All 22 were alive. None had given up. After nearly 2 years battling ice, sea, and mountains, Shackleton and his crew returned home. When they landed them, finally, we left the sea behind. It was truly a miracle. Shackleton had left with 27 men and returned with all 27 alive. This was possible due to Shackleton's leadership and courage, the crew's determination, and unbreakable teamwork. 106 years later, in 2022, investigators searching the sea found 10,000 feet deep in the Weddell Sea, Shackleton's ship, Endurance. The state of preservation is absolutely brilliant. No wood-eating parasites exist in the Weddell Sea. Incredibly, after 106 years, its condition was excellent due to the Antarctic depths. You can see its recent photos on screen. Today, if you visit South Georgia Island, you'll find Shackleton's grave. He'd set out to make history as the first to cross Antarctica on foot. Though he failed in his original plan, he achieved something even more miraculous and extraordinary. The year is 878 AD. England is not yet one nation, but a patchwork of fragile kingdoms: Wessex, Mercia, East Anglia, and Northumbria. 4 uneasy brothers in a troubled family, each vulnerable to the same enemy. For nearly a century, that enemy has come from across the northern seas, the Norsemen, the Danes, the heathen army that the world will one day call the Vikings. In 865, the nightmare began. A vast Viking coalition larger than any before landed on English shores. It became known as the Great Heathen Army. Led by ruthless warlords such as Halfdan Ragnarsson, Ivar the Boneless, and later Guthrum, they swept across the land like a storm of fire. Monasteries were looted, villages burned, and Saxon warriors cut down in their hundreds. One by one, the Saxon kingdoms fell. Northumbria was gone. East Anglia was gone. Mercia was crippled. Only Wessex, the land of the West Saxons, remained standing. At the heart of Wessex was King Alfred. Born in 849, the youngest son of King Ethelwulf, Alfred had not been destined to rule. Fate and the deaths of his brothers placed the crown upon his head. Unlike many rulers of his time, Alfred was not just a warrior. He was a scholar and a strategist. But now the enemy was at his gates, and no wisdom from books could stop them. By the end of 877, Wessex was in grave danger. The Vikings had seized much of its land and were wintering deep inside the kingdom, something they had never done before. This was not a raid to plunder and leave, it was a conquest. Their leader, Guthrum, wanted not just silver, but the throne of Wessex itself. Then came the moment that changed everything. January 878. 12th night, the feast after Christmas. Alfred's royal court was gathered in Chippenham, celebrating the season. The Saxons believed the Vikings were far away. They were wrong. Guthrum struck without warning. In the middle of the night, the Vikings stormed into the town. Torches lit the darkness, houses burned, and shouts turned to screams. Alfred's guards barely had time to react before the enemy was upon them. The royal forces scattered. The court was broken. With only a handful of loyal men, Alfred fled into the freezing night. They rode hard through the winter landscape, pursued by Viking scouts, until they reached the edge of the Somerset Levels, a wilderness of marshes, bogs, and tangled waterways. Here, in this damp and desolate land, Alfred found safety. The marshes could hide him, though they offered little comfort. For the people of Wessex, the king seemed to vanish. Rumors spread. Some claimed he had been killed. Others whispered that he had abandoned them. Viking rule tightened its grip. Villages surrendered to Guthrum. Some Saxon lords bent the knee to their new masters. It seemed the dream of a free Wessex had ended. But Alfred was alive. In the marshes, he was watching, listening, and planning. He understood the enemy's greatest advantage: mobility. Viking longships could sail rivers deep into the land, striking without warning. Armies were too slow to stop them. Alfred knew that to survive, he needed time, and time could only be bought by disappearing from their sight. In this age, a king's power depended on his presence. To vanish was to risk losing all authority. But Alfred saw invisibility as a weapon. If the Vikings believed him broken, they would grow careless. He could wait until the right moment to strike. The life he now lived was far from royal. His shelter was a crude hut in the marshes. His food was whatever could be hunted or fished. His only companions were a small band of loyal men. But in this exile, Alfred learned patience. He studied the Viking movements, learned their patterns, and thought about how to fight them on his own terms. The winter of 878 was one of England's darkest hours. Under Viking rule, the Saxon people lived in fear. The sound of oars in the night meant death could be moments away. Churches stood silent, stripped of their bells and treasures. In every hall, men whispered that the age of the Saxons was over. Yet, in the heart of the marshes, Alfred's spirit did not break. The Vikings believed the war was over, but for Alfred it had only changed shape. He was not gathering an army yet. That would come later.
But he was gathering something just as important: resolve. He was preparing for the day when he would step out of hiding and reclaim his kingdom. This was survival in its truest form. Not a single battle, but the endurance of will. A king without a throne. A man without an army. And yet, in the mud and mist, Alfred was becoming something greater than before. He was turning from a hunted fugitive into the leader who would one day defeat the greatest threat his people had ever faced. From this swamp, Alfred would rise, and with him, the hope of England itself.
The marshes of Somerset were no place for a king. Cold, wet, and shrouded in mist, they were a maze of reeds and bogs where even the locals sometimes lost their way. But here, among the pools and waterways, Alfred found his refuge. It was a strange new life for a man who had once ruled from a warm, bustling hall. Now his shelter was a crude hut. His meals were whatever fish could be caught or game could be trapped. The nights were long, the cold seeped into the bones, and the air was thick with the smell of damp earth. But in this bleak landscape, Alfred had something he had not enjoyed for weeks: safety. The Vikings could not easily reach him here, and their scouts feared the treacherous marsh paths. Alfred was not entirely alone. A small group of loyal warriors stayed with him, men who had refused to abandon their king. They acted as messengers, slipping out under cover of darkness to gather news and send word to trusted allies. Slowly, messages reached Saxon lords and the scattered survivors of his army. The king is alive. It was during this time that one of the most famous legends of Alfred was born. According to the story, he once took shelter in the home of a poor peasant woman who did not recognize him. She asked him to watch her loaves of bread baking over the fire while she worked elsewhere. But Alfred, lost in thought about his kingdom and the war, let the bread burn. When the woman returned, she scolded him sharply, telling him he was happy to eat the bread but too lazy to watch it. Alfred, rather than revealing who he was, accepted the rebuke with humility. Whether the story is entirely true or not, it captures something real about Alfred in this period: his patience, his humility, and his willingness to endure small humiliations for the sake of a greater goal. The marshes were teaching him lessons as valuable as any sword drill. Days turned into weeks. The Vikings tightened their hold on the land, confident that Wessex was broken. But Alfred knew that time was working in his favor. The longer he remained hidden, the more the Vikings would lower their guard. And while they grew comfortable, he was planning. He studied the way the enemy moved, where they camped, and how far their patrols went. He began sending quiet calls for support, urging his thanes to prepare their men for the day he would return. That day was not yet here, but Alfred understood that the moment would come suddenly, and when it did, he would need to act with speed and strength. The marshes also gave him something else: perspective. Away from the distractions of court life, Alfred could think clearly about the kind of kingdom he wanted to rebuild. He began to imagine reforms, stronger defenses, better trained soldiers, and even education for his people. But all of that would have to wait. First, he needed to survive. Winter slowly loosened its grip. The rivers thawed, the days grew longer, and the land began to stir. From his hiding place in Athelney, Alfred's network of messengers carried his words across the countryside. Men came quietly, sometimes one at a time, to join him. Farmers, hunters, and warriors who had lost everything to the Vikings now swore their loyalty to the hidden king. They trained in secret, hunting and sparring among the reeds, waiting for the moment when they could strike. For Alfred, these marshlands were more than a refuge. They were a forge. Every hardship, every cold night, every meager meal was hardening him for the fight to come. He had lost his kingdom once, but he would not lose it again. The Vikings believed the war was over. Alfred was preparing to prove them wrong. By early spring, Alfred's exile was turning into something far more dangerous for the Vikings: a hidden center of resistance. The marshlands of Athelney had become his fortress, a place where only those who knew the twisting paths could find their way. And from this damped, narrow stronghold, Alfred began to weave the threads of a rebellion. The first step was to test his reach. Trusted messengers slipped out under the cover of darkness, carrying Alfred's call to the far corners of Wessex. These were not grand proclamations or banners waving in the wind. They were whispered words in the corners of mead halls, quiet knocks on farmhouse doors, short scraps of parchment passed hand to hand. The message was simple: the king still lives, and he will rise again. The responses came slowly at first. A few warriors arrived alone, their armor dented, their cloaks ragged from months of hiding. Then small bands began to appear. Men who had lost family to Viking raids, men who had fought at Reading or Chippenham and escaped, men who had sworn they would not rest until the invaders were driven back into the sea. Life in Athelney was harsh, but it was here that these scattered survivors became something more than broken fighters. They trained together in the open spaces between the reed beds, practicing with sword and spear, learning to move silently along the marsh paths. Alfred himself moved among them, speaking not as a distant king, but as a comrade who shared their hunger and their cold. He knew every man's name. He listened to their grievances. And slowly they began to see not just a ruler, but a leader worth following into the fire. The Vikings, meanwhile, had grown comfortable. Guthrum, their war leader, believed Wessex had been crushed. His warriors feasted in captured towns, their patrols lazy and predictable. They had not yet realized that while they enjoyed their spoils, Alfred's army was sharpening its blades in the shadows. Alfred understood that he could not simply march out and challenge the Vikings head-on. His forces were still small compared to the enemy, and a single misstep could destroy everything he had built. But he also knew that the Saxon spirit was awakening again. Each day brought more men to Athelney, more weapons gathered, more food stored for the campaign ahead. The marshes echoed with the sound of training, the dull thud of spears in wooden targets, and the clash of blades. As Easter approached, Alfred made his move. He sent word to the Fyrds, the local militias, across Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. They were to meet him after the holy days, armed and ready for war. The plan was risky. Moving so many men in secrecy was no small task, and if the Vikings caught wind of it too soon, they could sweep down and crush the gathering before it even began. But Alfred's gamble paid off. On the appointed day, the marshes emptied of men. Columns of warriors moved through the countryside, converging at a place called Egbert's Stone. The sight must have stirred the heart of every Saxon present. Men from 3 shires, some still wearing the scars of earlier defeats, now standing together again under their king's banner. Here Alfred spoke to them. No one recorded his exact words, but they must have burned with conviction. He reminded them of the land they were fighting for, the families they had lost, and the oath they had sworn to defend their homes. He told them that this was their moment, that the enemy believed them beaten, and that such arrogance would be their downfall. The men answered not with speeches, but with the clang of spear butts striking shields, a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. From Egbert's Stone they marched as one, their numbers swelling as villagers joined the column. Alfred's small band of marshland survivors had transformed into a real army, one with the will to fight and the belief that victory was possible. The Vikings were no longer facing a scattered resistance. They were about to face Alfred the Great, reborn from exile, leading a people who had been driven to the brink and clawed their way back. And this time, the Saxons would not be the ones running. By early spring, Alfred's exile was turning into something far more dangerous for the Vikings, a hidden center of resistance. The marshlands of Athelney had become his fortress, a place where only those who knew the twisting paths could find their way. And from this damp, narrow stronghold, Alfred began to weave the threads of a rebellion. The first step was to test his reach. Trusted messengers slipped out under the cover of darkness, carrying Alfred's call to the far corners of Wessex. These were not grand proclamations or banners waving in the wind. They were whispered words in the corners of mead halls, quiet knocks on farmhouse doors. Short scraps of parchment passed hand to hand. The message was simple: the king still lives, and he will rise again. The responses came slowly at first. A few warriors arrived alone, their armor dented, their cloaks ragged from months of hiding. Then small bands began to appear. Men who had lost family to Viking raids, men who had fought at Reading or Chippenham and escaped, men who had sworn they would not rest until the invaders were driven back into the sea. Life in Athelney was harsh, but it was here that these scattered survivors became something more than broken fighters. They trained together in the open spaces between the reed beds, practicing with sword and spear, learning to move silently along the marsh paths. Alfred himself moved among them, speaking not as a distant king, but as a comrade who shared their hunger and their cold. He knew every man's name. He listened to their grievances. And slowly, they began to see not just a ruler, but a leader worth following into the fire. The Vikings, meanwhile, had grown comfortable. Guthrum, their war leader, believed Wessex had been crushed. His warriors feasted in captured towns, their patrols lazy and predictable. They had not yet realized that while they enjoyed their spoils, Alfred's army was sharpening its blades in the shadows. Alfred understood that he could not simply march out and challenge the Vikings head-on. His forces were still small compared to the enemy, and a single misstep could destroy everything he had built. But he also knew that the Saxon spirit was awakening again. Each day brought more men to Athelney, more weapons gathered, more food stored for the campaign ahead. The marshes echoed with the sound of training, the dull thud of spears and wooden targets, and the clash of blades. As Easter approached, Alfred made his move. He sent word to the Fyrds, the local militias, across Somerset, Wiltshire, and Hampshire. They were to meet him after the holy days, armed and ready for war. The plan was risky. Moving so many men in secrecy was no small task, and if the Vikings caught wind of it too soon, they could sweep down and crush the gathering before it even began. But Alfred's gamble paid off. On the appointed day, the marshes emptied of men. Columns of warriors moved through the countryside, converging at a place called Egbertstone. The sight must have stirred the heart of every Saxon present. Men from 3 shires, some still wearing the scars of earlier defeats, now standing together again under their king's banner. Here, Alfred spoke to them. No one recorded his exact words, but they must have burned with conviction. He reminded them of the land they were fighting for, the families they had lost, and the oath they had sworn to defend their homes. He told them that this was their moment, that the enemy believed them beaten, and that such arrogance would be their downfall. The men answered not with speeches, but with the clang of spear butts striking shields, a sound like thunder rolling across the hills. From Egbertstone they marched as one, their numbers swelling as villagers joined the column. Alfred's small band of marshland survivors had transformed into a real army, one with the will to fight and the belief that victory was possible. The Vikings were no longer facing a scattered resistance. They were about to face Alfred the Great, reborn from exile, leading a people who had been driven to the brink and clawed their way back. And this time, the Saxons would not be the ones running. The battlefield at Edington was quiet now. The clash of steel had faded, the war cries had died, and only the wind moved across the grass. Alfred stood among his men, the weight of victory heavy on his shoulders. They had done it. Against all odds, against the shadow of defeat that had haunted them for months, they had stood their ground and won. But Alfred knew this victory was more than a single battle. If Wessex was to survive, if his people were to live without fear, this moment had to be the beginning of peace, not just another pause before the next wave of bloodshed. The Danes were trapped in their fortress, surrounded and starving. Days turned into nights, and the men inside grew weaker. Guthrum, the fearsome Viking leader who had once driven Alfred into the marshes, now faced the truth. His army was broken, his supplies gone, his hope fading. At last, messengers emerged from the fortress, hands raised in surrender. They came to Alfred with an offer. Guthrum would yield. But Alfred, ever cautious, demanded more than just a promise to leave. He wanted a peace that would last. The negotiations began, not with swords, but with words. Alfred and Guthrum faced each other, two men who had fought not just for land, but for the future of their people. Alfred's terms were firm but fair. The Danes would swear an oath to leave Wessex, to honor the new boundaries between their lands and the Saxon kingdom. And Guthrum himself would take a step that no Viking warlord had ever taken before. He would accept baptism as a Christian. It was more than a religious act. It was a symbolic bridge between two worlds. Guthrum agreed. In a small, solemn ceremony, he stood in the waters, the weight of his warrior's life behind him, and emerged with a new name, Athelstan. Alfred himself stood as his godfather, sealing not just a truce, but a personal bond between former enemies. With the treaty signed and the oath sworn, the Viking army withdrew from Wessex. The threat that had once seemed unstoppable was gone, at least for now. The fields and villages they had once burned began to recover. Farmers returned to their land, craftsmen to their work, families to their homes. But Alfred did not waste the peace. He knew it was fragile, that the Danes might one day return, and that other enemies would rise. He set about strengthening Wessex from within. He reorganized his army so that part of it was always ready for defense, while the rest tended to their farms and families. He built a chain of fortified towns, burhs, strategically placed so that no part of his kingdom would be more than a day's ride from help. He also turned his attention to learning and law. Alfred believed that strength was not just in weapons, but in the mind. He gathered scholars, translated important books into English so his people could read them, and set down laws that balanced justice with mercy. In his vision, Wessex was not just a place to survive, it was a place to thrive. The man who had once hidden in a swamp, cooking stolen bread on a stranger's fire, was now a king who shaped the destiny of his land. The marshes of Athelney had been a prison once, but they had also been a crucible, burning away fear, doubt, and weakness, leaving only the steel of resolve. And though Alfred could never know it for certain, the foundations he laid would one day grow into something greater than even Wessex, the United Kingdom of England. His victory at Edington was not just the survival of a man or a king, it was the survival of a nation's hope. Years later, when people spoke of Alfred, they did not just remember the battles he fought. They remembered the way he fought them, with patience when others would have rushed, with strategy when others would have gambled, with mercy when others would have destroyed. He was called Alfred the Great, not because he never fell, but because when he did, he found the strength to rise again. And in the story of his survival, from the marshes to the battlefield, from exile to triumph, lies a truth as old as history itself. Sometimes the hardest road leads to the greatest victory.
Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little darker. A time of plagues, punishments, and pottage. We're diving into what life was really like during the Middle Ages. Forget the castles and chivalry Hollywood sold you. The truth, you probably wouldn't last a single day. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the year 1325. The good news? You're alive. The bad news? So are the fleas. Your bed is a half-rotted straw mattress stuffed with bugs and hay that smells like a barn floor. Because it was a barn floor 3 months ago. There's no memory foam, no pillows, and definitely no Egyptian cotton sheets. Just a wool blanket that hasn't been washed since last winter and now weighs roughly as much as a small cow from the accumulated grime. You blink awake as the church bell clangs in the distance. It's the medieval version of an alarm clock, only louder and somehow even less merciful. Your home is a wooden hut with one room, no windows, and a charming open-concept floor plan where your family, livestock, and domestic insects all share the same space. The smell? Oh, it's a fragrant symphony. A subtle blend of stale beer, human sweat, goat, and something you pray isn't mold, but know in your soul probably is. Scented candles haven't been invented, and even if they were, they just melt on your dirt floor. You try to stretch but immediately regret it because the air is freezing and your joints ache. You're 22 years old, which in medieval terms is roughly middle-aged. Your spine creaks like an old wooden door, and your knees sound like a bag of rocks being shaken by a confused peasant. Getting out of bed is a gamble. The floor is either wet from last night's rain, which leaks through the thatched roof, or crusty from something your neighbor's chicken did. Either way, your bare feet are now part of the ecosystem. Oh, and privacy? What's that? Your entire family, and maybe a random cousin who just never left, are waking up beside you. There's no bedroom, no curtains, no me time, just communal everything. Welcome to morning in medieval Europe, where you're never truly alone, because parasites, rodents, and 8 other people are always with you. And this is just how your day starts. It only gets worse from here. So you've managed to crawl out of your medieval haystack of horrors. Congrats! Now nature calls. And it's not calling politely, it's screaming. Here's the part where you start missing the modern bathroom. There's no toilet, no seat, no toilet paper, no flush, not even a mildly resentful plunger in the corner. In the 14th century, relieving yourself is an adventure, a social experiment, and often a small public event. If you're a peasant, your bathroom is likely a wooden bucket behind the house, which is already full because Uncle Wolfstan had a rough night after eating bad turnips. The smell is biblical. You hold your breath, do your business, and then, here's the kicker. Toss it into the street. Yes, the street. You're supposed to shout something like, "Gardez-loo," before dumping it out the window. That's Old French for watch out below, although frankly no one ever moves fast enough. Streets in medieval towns are open sewers, a charming river of human waste, animal droppings, and mystery liquids you'd rather not examine. If you're lucky enough to live in a town with public latrines, congratulations! You get to sit shoulder to shoulder with strangers in an outhouse where privacy is a myth and ventilation is a cruel joke. You might make some small talk, but try not to breathe too deeply. Toilet paper? Never heard of it. Most people wipe with straw, leaves, rags, moss, or if they're feeling especially indulgent, a scrap of wool. Sometimes nothing at all, which might explain why handshakes weren't popular yet. And if you're in a castle, surely it's better, right? Well, sort of. You might have a garderobe, a hole in the wall that drops your waist directly into the moat. Great idea, except that your enemies know this. And yes, attackers sometimes climbed in through the waist chute. Talk about entering through the back door. So, whether you're a farmer or a baron, medieval toileting is a humiliation ritual. It's cold, it's public, it's dangerous, and it's never not disgusting.
One slip on a whetstone path and you're face first in humanity's leftovers. And you still haven't brushed your teeth, but we'll get to that next. You survived the toilet. You deserve a reward, right? Maybe a nice breakfast. Something warm, delicious, comforting. Sorry, this is medieval Europe. Nothing is comforting here. Breakfast, if you can call it that, is a grim affair. There are no eggs Benedict, no coffee machines sputtering awake, and certainly no avocado toast. You sit down, or squat, near the fire to a wooden bowl of something that looks like it was scraped off a muddy boot. Welcome to your daily ration of pottage. Pottage is a thick, gloopy stew made of whatever you can find. Grains, root vegetables, maybe a few beans if you're lucky. It's been simmering in the same pot for days, sometimes weeks, and new ingredients are just dumped on top of the old ones. It's less of a recipe and more of an ongoing edible experiment. On the side, a hunk of bread so hard it could deflect arrows. It's made from coarse rye or barley flour, often bulked up with sawdust, ground up acorns, or other creative ingredients, because wheat is a rich man's fantasy. This loaf is not your friend. You don't slice it, you negotiate with it. What about drinks? You're not sipping orange juice or an oat merg latte, you're drinking beer. Yes, beer. Why? Because the water is teeming with parasites and filth. So you start your day with weak ale, low alcohol, high survivability. Kids drink it too. No one's happy about it, but at least it won't kill you immediately. Want some meat or cheese? Dream on. That's for Sundays and saints' feast days, and only if your lord is feeling generous. Most peasants don't eat meat more than a few times a year. As for fresh fruit, only when it's in season and not already fermented into wine. And don't even think about spices unless you're royalty. A pinch of pepper costs more than your monthly wages. Salt is valuable enough to be locked away. So, you chew your gritty bread, gulp your medieval beer, and try not to think about the rat that may have nibbled your porridge in the night. Breakfast doesn't energize you. It just happens to you. And now that you're properly underfed, it's time to work like your life depends on it, because it absolutely does. So, you've eaten your sad medieval breakfast, and now it's time to get dressed. Not that it'll help. Your wardrobe consists of exactly one outfit. One. It's a rough wool tunic or linen shift that you've worn every day for months, possibly years. There is no such thing as seasonal fashion. There's just wear this until it disintegrates or gives you a fungal infection. Underwear? Optional. If you're lucky, maybe a linen undertunic. If you're not, well, you're going commando under layers of scratchy, sweaty wool, all lovingly stitched together by someone who probably had no idea what a seam was supposed to look like. There's also no washing machine, no soap, and absolutely no dry cleaner in sight. So your clothes are stained, stiff, and smelt like a compost pile that's been left to marinate in a pigsty. Even if you wanted to wash them, it's not easy. You'd have to haul water from a river or well, heat it over a fire, scrub your tunic on a board with ashes or lye, and hang it in the sun, which is out approximately 3 days a year. And don't get me started on shoes. If you own any, they're made of untreated leather, barely stitched together, and offer as much arc support as a banana peel. Most peasants just go barefoot, through mud, through dung, through medieval landmines, aka sharp rocks and disease puddles. All this means one thing. Your skin hates you. You itch constantly. Fleas, lice, and bed bugs live rent-free on your body. Everyone has them. Nobles, lousy monks, itchy children, walking insect farms. No one escapes. You'll be scratching your armpit with a wooden spoon while chatting with the local priest, and no one will even bat an eye. Your skin is raw from rubbing, your scalp a battlefield of bites. And if you develop a rash, well, too bad. There's no dermatologist, no hydrocortisone, no one to tell you it's probably scabies. You just keep on suffering. And if you're lucky enough not to get an infection, great. That rash will simply accompany you for the next 6 months like an unwanted medieval sidekick. Now that you're fully dressed in itches and damp wool, it's time to flash that morning smile.
Except you don't. Because in the Middle Ages, smiling is a dangerous game. Not emotionally, dentally. There's no toothbrush, no toothpaste, no mouthwash, no floss. The concept of oral hygiene is about as popular as bathing, which is to say, not very. Some people might chew on a twig or rinse with wine or vinegar, but for the most part, your teeth are on their own. And they're not doing well. By the time you hit your mid-20s, your smile looks like something pulled from a haunted crypt. Cavities are rampant, gums are swollen, and those aren't just food stains on your teeth. That's decay. You have more rot in your mouth than a medieval root cellar. Sugar, while not yet everywhere, is becoming more common among the rich. Imported at great cost, mostly used in small cakes or to show off wealth. If you're a noble, congratulations. You get to rot your teeth faster than the peasants. If you're poor, you'll do it slowly over time with fermented bread, gritty porridge, and years of hard chewing. Toothaches? Get used to them. They're like medieval weather, always there in the background. The kind of pain that makes you consider praying, drinking, or pulling the tooth out yourself with a pair of pliers. And that's not a joke. That was the actual treatment. Dentists didn't really exist, but barber surgeons did. Yes, the same guy who cuts your hair is also pulling your molars out by candlelight with an iron hook and zero anesthesia. Infected tooth? Hope you like fevers, because without antibiotics, it can easily turn into sepsis and kill you from a toothache. That's right, the same thing that sends us to a pharmacy today could be your funeral in the 1300s. And there's no relief on the social front either. Kissing? Good luck. Halitosis, bad breath, is everywhere. If you're single, you're not judged by your smile. You're judged by your land and your livestock. In short, your mouth is a battlefield, and it's losing the war.
Now that your teeth are throbbing, let's head outside. Because your real job, the one that will break your back, is just getting started. Time to head to work. Except there's no office, no desk, no coffee break, and no chance of promotion. Your job, if you're like 90% of the population, is simple. Don't die while laboring for someone else's comfort. You're a peasant. Congratulations. That means you work the land that belongs to a lord who probably doesn't remember your name. You rise with the sun and stop only when it disappears behind the trees. Your tools? A wooden hoe, a rusty sickle, and whatever bones are still intact in your body. There's no weekend, there's no clocking out. There's only sunrise to sunset 6 days a week. Sunday is off, but only if you're harvesting, fighting off raiders, or praying feverishly for your infected toe to stop turning black. The work is brutal. Fields are plowed by hand or with oxen if you're rich enough to afford one. You dig ditches, sow seeds, pull weeds, and carry water until your spine begins to resemble the letter S. No one cares if you're tired. No one's asking how your mental health is doing. If you're a woman, surprise, you don't just do field work. You also care for children, clean, cook, spin wool, feed animals, and pretend your husband's lice infestation isn't slowly migrating to your side of the bed. Children? They start helping out around age 5. No school, no toys, just a tiny wooden rake and a dream of one day not dying of the flu. And if you're one of the few who isn't a farmer, maybe you're a blacksmith, a tanner, or a cooper, great. You still work with fire, chemicals, or animal guts all day in poorly ventilated sheds. The pay? Basically survival. The perks? Occasional bleeding. Break a bone? Too bad. Get a fever, drink some warm beer, and keep going. You can't afford to stop, not even for a day. Because if you don't work, you don't eat. And if you don't eat, well, medieval Europe has a solution for that. It's called being replaced. So you grip your shovel, ignore the blisters, and keep digging. Because in the Middle Ages, your job isn't a career. It's a slow-motion endurance test. Now that your back is on fire from laboring in the fields, let's talk about the weather. Because in the Middle Ages, temperature is less about seasons and more about ongoing punishment from the sky.
Let's start with winter.
There's no insulation, no central heating, and no weathering. Just wooden walls with gaps you could throw a chicken through. Your windows? Covered with cloth, not glass. The fire in the hearth, nice in theory, but you don't have enough wood fire to keep it going because wood is expensive and gathering it from the forest is sometimes illegal. Yes, you can be executed for picking up the wrong stick from the wrong forest. You bundle up in your one damp wool tunic, huddle near the dying embers, and still wake up with your nose frozen. Your feet? Permanently cold, often damp. Your fingers? So stiff they feel like tiny medieval popsicles. Frostbite isn't diagnosed, it's just called bad luck. Now fast forward to summer. Sounds better, right? Wrong. In summer, your home turns into a clay oven. There's no fan, no cross breeze, and absolutely no deodorant. You sweat through your layers, but you can't remove them because showing too much skin is scandalous and also invites sunburn, insect bites, and social judgment. The flies are out in full force, attracted to your unwashed body and the smell of last week's goat stew that's still fermenting in the corner. Mosquitoes buzz by your ear while you sleep, assuming you can sleep through the sound of your neighbors yelling and babies crying. In the fields, the sun bakes you. No sunblock, no hat, unless you fashioned one out of straw like some desperate scarecrow. And the worst part, you still have to work. Heat stroke is just called taking a bad turn. So you're either shivering in your own hovel, wondering if your toes will make it to spring, or you're sweating through your only pair of socks while your thighs chafe into oblivion. And the one thing that never changes, no matter the season, your clothes still itch, your food is still terrible, and your next job is still waiting. Welcome to climate control, medieval style. There is none. Feeling thirsty? Need to freshen up? Want to splash a little water on your face to wake up from this damp fever dream of a life? Too bad. In medieval times, water isn't your friend. It's trying to murder you. Quietly. Let's start with drinking. The nearby stream looks fresh, bubbling and clear like something out of a fantasy movie. But spoiler alert, it's not. Upstream, someone just dumped a chamber pot into it. And if not that, then a dead pig is probably decomposing in it. Parasites, bacteria, and the entire microbial army of medieval Europe await in every sip. That's why people drink beer. Yes, beer. Even children. But before you imagine medieval kids doing keg stands, understand that it was small beer, weak in alcohol, strong in survival. Brewing boiled the water, so it was safer than whatever flowed through the town ditch. Wine was another option, if you were rich enough to afford it and unconcerned with functioning properly before noon. What about bathing? Surely water was used for cleaning. In theory, yes. In practice, absolutely not. See, back then, people believed bathing actually opened your pores and let the disease in. That's right. Washing yourself was considered medically risky. You were cleaner, apparently, if you never removed the protective layer of filth caked onto your skin. Communal bathhouses did exist, but they quickly gained reputations as places for gossip, scandal, and sometimes full-on medieval extracurriculars. So naturally, the church got involved and shut many down. Even if you did want to bathe, it was a full production. You'd need to fetch water from the well, boil it over a fire, fill a wooden tub that leaked, and then pray no one else in the house used it before you, or worse, after. And rainwater? Collected in open barrels where birds poop, insects breed, and moss thrives. Sounds refreshing, doesn't it? So whether it's going in your mouth, on your body, or onto your crops, water in the Middle Ages is less of a life source and more of a gamble. One wrong gulp, and you're spending your final days sweating in a straw bed, clutching your stomach and contemplating all your life choices. Next time you sip tap water, raise a glass for our ancestors.
They didn't have the luxury of hydration without hazard. So you drank the water. Or maybe you didn't. Maybe you just stubbed your toe on a rock shaped like disappointment. Either way, you're sick. You need help. You need a doctor. Too bad you live in the Middle Ages, where medicine is really just polite torture with a theology degree. Let's start with a diagnosis. Everything wrong with you, whether it's a cough, rash, broken bone, or the creeping plague, is caused by your humors being out of balance. The four humors were blood,
phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. According to medieval science, your health depends on keeping them balanced, like some sort of internal soup. Got a fever? Too much blood. The answer? Bloodletting. That's right. Let's drain your life force into a bowl using a dull blade or a hungry leech. And yes, barbers were often doing it. Imagine getting a haircut and a hemoglobin extraction in one sitting. 2 for 1, baby. Feeling sad or anxious? That's clearly in excess of black bile. The cure? Laxatives. Maybe a warm herbal purge or just prayers and a cold compress, while everyone avoids eye contact with you and starts carving your coffin. Now, if you break a bone or get a nasty wound, you're in real trouble. There's no anesthesia unless you count passing out from pain. Surgery is done with knives that haven't been cleaned since the Crusades. Tools are heated over fire, not for sterilization, but because they just look scarier that way. Antibiotics, centuries away. Germ theory, not invented yet. They think disease comes from bad air or God being annoyed with your moral failings. Got a stomach ache? Must have been your sinful thoughts. Hope you like confessing while vomiting. If your condition gets worse, you'll be treated with more leeches, possibly some crushed beetles, and a priest at your bedside giving last rites, just in case. At this point, they're preparing for the cure known as death. And if by some miracle you recover, everyone just assumes God took pity on you, the doctor takes full credit, and the leech gets promoted. So yes, in the Middle Ages, medicine is less about healing and more about surviving the cure. After a long day of labor, lice, and leeches, it's finally time to eat. You shuffle back to your hovel, stomach growling, ready for the one joy left in life, a warm meal. Bad news. Your meal is probably trying to kill you. Let's begin with the basics. Food preservation doesn't really exist. There's no fridge, no freezer, just salt, smoke, or the hope that winter air keeps things fresh. Your meat, if you're lucky enough to have any, has been hanging for days, covered in flies, marinated in questionable brine, and possibly shared with a rat or two. Bread is the cornerstone of the medieval diet, but even that isn't safe. In bad harvest years, desperate peasants bulk it up with bark, sawdust, or even clay to make it stretch. And if it's rye season, there's a bonus: ergot, a fungus that causes convulsions, hallucinations, and sometimes death. It's like eating bread laced with LSD and tetanus. Vegetables? Only if they're in the season. And you know what's always in season? Turnips. So many turnips. Boiled, mashed, or floating in pottage, which, if you remember from earlier, is basically a hot swamp of mystery ingredients that's been simmering since your great-grandfather's funeral. Fruit might be available in the fall, but it rots quickly, and sugar is rare, expensive, and hoarded by the rich to show off their blackened teeth. Dairy? Another gamble. Fresh milk spoils in hours. Butter and cheese fare better, but they're loaded with bacteria. People eat them anyway because, frankly, it's either that or chew your boot leather. And let's talk about seasoning. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, or nutmeg worth more than gold. For the average peasant, flavor comes from onions, salt if you're lucky, and pain. Most meals taste like wet burlap sprinkled with sadness. But food isn't just a health hazard. It's a political one. Game animals belong to the Lord, not you. Caught poaching a rabbit, you could be fined, imprisoned, or even executed. That's right, your dinner could get you hanged. So as you sit down to eat your gray stew by flickering firelight, remember, every bite is a risk. But you eat anyway, because in the Middle Ages, food doesn't nourish. It tests you. You've worked, suffered, and barely digested your suspicious stew. You might think the day is winding down, but don't get too relaxed, because God is watching. So is the priest. And so is your neighbor Agnes, who will absolutely rat you out if you miss Mass. In medieval Europe, religion isn't just part of life, it is life. The church controls your calendar, your laws, your education, if you can read, your birth, marriage, death, and everything in between. Think of it as your spiritual landlord, and you're always behind on rent. Every day is structured around prayer bells. The town church bell rings in the morning, noon, and night. Not because people need reminders, but because missing prayer is a sin. Forget to bow? Sin. Eat meat on a Friday? Sin. Think about your neighbor's wife and that one dream? Double sin. And yes, hell is very real. Vividly real. Priests describe it in glorious detail. Rivers of fire, lakes of boiling blood, demons with pitchforks, and eternal wailing. If the plague doesn't scare you, eternal damnation definitely will. You can't read the Bible yourself because it's written in Latin, a language reserved for monks, clergy, and that one noble kid who's too good for dirt. You rely on the church to interpret everything for you. That means if the priest says your crop failure is because you didn't pray hard enough, well, time to kneel harder. Tithes, a tenth of everything you own, are mandatory. If you grow wheat, you give wheat. If you raise chickens, you give eggs. If you have nothing, congratulations, you are spiritually bankrupt and financially doomed. Holidays? They're holy days, dozens of them. And while they offer breaks from labor, they're not for fun. Therefore, attending Mass, fasting, confessing sins, and reminding yourself that joy is a dangerous indulgence. Questioning the church is dangerous. Heretics are burned, witches are drowned, blasphemers are flogged, and skeptics are quickly reformed. So you go through the motions. You chant, you bow, you pray that your soul, after enduring this dirt-covered life, might finally land in paradise, assuming the priest likes you. Because in the Middle Ages, God may be merciful, but the church, not so much. If you thought being a medieval peasant was rough, try doing it as a woman. All the filth, famine, and fear, plus childbirth, subservience, and social invisibility. In the Middle Ages, being a woman is like playing life on hard mode, with no health potions and no restart button. From birth, a girl's life path is pretty much locked in. Marry young, bear children, serve your husband, die tired. Education? Not likely. Unless you're from a noble family and sent to a convent, your intellectual development stops around the time you learn how to churn butter and patch a tunic. Marriage happens early. Really early. It's not weird to be betrothed at 12 and pregnant by 14. It's not about love, it's about land, livestock, and alliances. Your opinion? Not required. Once married, you're basically your husband's property. Your job is to produce heirs, feed everyone, keep the house running, and not complain. Because complaining might get you branded a nag, or worse, a witch. That label comes with a complimentary drowning or burning, depending on local fashion. Childbirth is a death lottery. There's no prenatal care, no sterile tools, no anesthesia. Midwives do their best, but even minor complications can mean death for the mother, the child, or both. Some women survive 10 pregnancies. Many don't survive 2. But don't worry, once the baby's out, your work increases. Now you have a screaming infant in a lice-ridden hut, and you're expected to nurse, cook, clean, and still help in the fields. You don't get a break. You are the break for everyone else. If you're unmarried, you're suspicious. If you're widowed, you're vulnerable. If you're outspoken, you're dangerous. Women who didn't conform were often accused of witchcraft, especially if they had herbal knowledge, a strong personality, or just looked at someone funny on a rainy Tuesday. Even in the church, your role is limited. Nuns lived under strict rules, no speaking without permission, no freedom of movement, and your spiritual worth always ranked below men. In short, if you're a woman in the Middle Ages, you're expected to endure, obey, reproduce, and suffer in silence, ideally while smiling. Because even in a time of universal suffering, women were somehow expected to suffer gracefully.
So far, you've battled filth, starvation, social injustice, and possibly a goat. But just when you think your day can't get any worse, here comes violence. Loud, bloody, and often completely acceptable by medieval standards. Let's be clear, the Middle Ages were not peaceful. The idea of law and order mostly meant hoping the local lord wasn't in a bad mood. Violence is everywhere. In the home, in the streets, on the battlefield, in church disputes, and sometimes in line at the communal bread oven. Crime is common, punishment is brutal, and justice is more performance art than protection. Steal a loaf of bread, you could lose a hand. Accused of lying, your tongue might get pierced. Gossip too much, meet the scold's bridle. A metal mask strapped to your head with a bar in your mouth. For correction, of course. Let's say you're accused of something serious. Heresy, theft, witchcraft. How do you prove your innocence? By being tortured, obviously. Welcome to trial by ordeal. One version, you stick your hand in boiling water to retrieve a stone. If it heals without infection, you're innocent. If not, guilty. Another option, you're tossed into a river. Sink? Innocent. And probably dead. Float? Guilty. And punished anyway. It's like a medieval game show where the prize is survival, and the host is actively rooting against you. If you're sentenced to death, that's a public event. Executions are performed in front of cheering crowds. Hangings, beheadings, burnings. Sometimes people bring snacks. It's the medieval equivalent of cable TV. Domestic violence? Completely normal. Husbands were allowed, even expected, to discipline wives and children. Street fights? Commonplace. You could be beaten just for looking the wrong way at a noble's horse. And war? Always simmering. Local feuds, territorial disputes, religious crusades. Someone's always marching off to stab someone else in the name of honor, God, or boredom. Violence isn't a breakdown of society in the Middle Ages. It is society. Everyone lives with the constant knowledge that life is fragile, justice is arbitrary, and your neighbor might bash your head in over a pig. So walk carefully, keep your eyes down, and never trust anyone with a club. At this point, you've made it through the lice, the leeches, the laundryless misery, and the looming threat of public disembowelment. But now comes the final chapter of most medieval lives, an early and unglamorous death. If you're alive and still breathing past the age of 40, you're practically a celebrity. You might even be referred to as the Old One, which is less of a nickname and more of a statistical miracle. Let's break it down. The average life expectancy hovers around 30 to 40 years, but that number is dragged down heavily by infant mortality. Nearly half of all children died before reaching age 5. Disease, malnutrition, or one bad winter was all it took. No vaccines, no antibiotics, no hope. If you survived childhood, you entered adulthood already exhausted. Work began as soon as you could walk upright, and by your mid-20s, your joints creaked like a monastery door. You might be missing several teeth, a finger, and most of your original optimism. Women faced a particularly deadly gauntlet: childbirth. It was one of the leading causes of death for medieval women. No pain relief, no medical intervention. Just prayer, hot water, and someone holding your hand while you bled out on a straw-stuffed cot. For men, the dangers were different but equally relentless.
farming accidents, infections from minor wounds, a neighbor's drunken rage, a crusade gone sideways. Even walking to the market could be risky if you crossed paths with a bored bandit or an angry tax collector. Death could also come quietly, from the plague, which turned cities into cemeteries overnight, from famine, which could last entire seasons, thinning out entire villages, or from bad luck, like eating spoiled grain and spending your final hours hallucinating and screaming at the walls. And funerals? You were lucky if you got one. Bodies were often buried quickly to avoid disease. No embalming, no polished coffins, just a hole, a few murmured prayers, and a shallow mound of earth if there was enough space left in the churchyard. So yes, in medieval times, life was brutal, short, and constantly under siege by death in all its casual forms. You didn't retire, you just stopped showing up. And speaking of exits, let's move on to your final chapter. The medieval dream dies. So how's your day been? You've woken up in filth, relieved yourself into a bucket, brushed your teeth with wishful thinking, nearly passed out from hunger, worked until your spine cried for mercy, scratched your way through itchy wool, prayed to not get plague, and barely dodged a public execution for owning a squirrel. Welcome to a single day in medieval Europe. Still dreaming of becoming a knight? Think again. That romanticized version of the Middle Ages, gallant swordsmen, noble ladies in towers, heroic battles, and feasts in candlelit great halls, it's a myth, polished by fairy tales and fantasy books. In truth, the medieval world was gritty, cruel, and deeply unfair. Hierarchy was everything. If you were born poor, you stayed poor. If you were born rich, congratulations, you had a better chance of surviving. But you were still one bad soup away from dysentery and a hasty burial. Even the nobles weren't immune to misery. Castles were drafty stone refrigerators filled with fleas, smoke, and politically motivated marriages. Sure, you had a fur cloak and a goblet of wine, but also a 50% chance of dying in a skirmish or from an infected splinter. Not exactly luxury. The simpler times weren't simple. They were relentless. Everything took longer. Everything hurt more. Everything from childbirth to chewing came with consequences. Life was survival, not leisure. And if you did find a quiet moment to think, to dream, to imagine something better, there wasn't much you could do with it. No upward mobility, no modern medicine, no internet to Google, "What's this weird rash?" You lived, suffered, worked, and died within a 10-mile radius of where you were born. But here's the wildest part. Through all of this, people still laughed, sang songs, told stories, fell in love, and found meaning. Not because life was easy, but because humans are stubborn like that. Even in the darkest chapters, they made space for light. So tonight, when you slip into your clean bed with indoor plumbing, antibiotics, and central heating, maybe say a quiet thank you to the modern world and to your ancestors who fought rats, famine, and feudalism so you wouldn't have to.